first, why don't you just tell me your name, when and where you were born?
Name Orville Horn, Horn, born Cleveland, Ohio. Actually, Garfield Heights, Ohio. It's a suburb of Cleveland. Came to Colorado here first time in 1942, I believe it was, to Pueblo. It's where I picked up the 381st Air Bomb Group. Previous to that, I was in England as a member of the RAF, fighting fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes. I was a little too young to get in the Army Air Corps. Tried to. That was in December 1st of, or actually December, I think it was the 3rd or 4th of 41 when the Japs attacked. And they told me to go home and grow up. So I jumped in. I had my own plane at the time because I flew. I flew since I was about, 11, 12 years old. My dad taught me to fly. He was with the Rickenbackers flying 94th Aero Squadron in World War I, that is. And when the war was over, he bought a surplus, an old Jenny. That's, in fact, what he taught me to fly. And, I don't know, I was 12, 13 years old. I was doing crop dusting and things like that when we were out of school. And as I said, I was trying to get into the Army Air Corps. And when they wouldn't take me, I jumped in my bird and flew across Lake Erie and got into Canada and enlisted in the RCAF. And I started to go through their flight schools, but hell, I had more time, air time, than most of the instructors had. So they turned around and usually after flight school and you had your pilot's certificate, it took them about a year to make a fighter pilot. But I was with a guy by the name of, he had what they called the flying circus. This is before the war. And we just traveled all over the United States. And all of the pilots that taught me air combat there was one German who was with the Goring's, the flying circus, and that was the Richthofen's group. And Goring was the led it for after Richtofen got killed. And he was an ace himself. An ace being he's down British and American pilots. But the rest of them were all Americans. And they were the ones that really taught me air combat, fighter air-to-air combat. So I had a leg up a bit when I got into the RCAF. But they shipped me right over to England, and I was flying fighters and Spits. First I was flying Hurricanes, going after the bombers because they were coming over at night. And they had what they called the Punch and Judy show. Punch and Judy was radar controlled us. And they'd get a vector and give us a vector as to where the bomber was coming across. And at that time, we flew whatever heading they gave us. And when we could see the plane, the German aircraft, you'd radio back in punch. And when you actually put your guns on it and saw the plane where you could shoot it, you hollered Judy. And that's when you let loose. And if you're lucky enough, you knocked him down if you didn't get you down. But after that, I got 2 German aircraft. And then they put me in the Spitz. And I went to a place called Biggin Hill, which was right outside of London. It was a little northeast of London. And I got 1 German aircraft there, and I believe it was a 110. No, it was a 109, the Messerschmitt 109. And right after that is when the American Air Corps decided they wanted me, and they pulled us out of the RCAF or the RAF. And I understand that the United States government paid the English government $25,000 per head for every American pilot. And let's say they conscripted us right into the Army Air Corps. But they didn't need fighter pilots. What they really needed was bomber pilots. And from there, they shipped me back to the United States, to Pueblo, where I picked up my group, the 381st. They were going through phase 3, which is formation flying. And we spent a little over 30 days there, and then they shipped us back overseas. And I was with Ridgewell. Ridgewell was the closest town to us. That was where my base was, the 164th Squadron and group, I'm sorry. And we see, we left there, I think our first raid was the June. And at that time, we went into Brussels and bombed General Motors and Ford plants, which were taken over by the Germans at that time. And we came back, and which was a successful mission. And we thought that was the way the missions were going to run. But believe me, it wasn't. That was a milk run as far as we were concerned. And after that, we put quite a few missions through. Actually, I did 52nd mission, which was the very last mission of World War II. I did the first and the last. I went through 51 missions without getting a scratch, not even a hangnail. But the 52nd is when I got hit. Took a 30 millimeter cannon shell, the left-hand seat, that blew my back out. And I remember landing the plane. That's the last thing I remember. I remember in a C-46, I think it was, being flown to Walter Reed Hospital back in the States. And that's basically it.
All this in B-17s then?
Right. Yeah. I was with the 1st Air Division, which was nothing but 17s. The 2nd was all B-24s, and the 3rd was also B-17s.
What was the name of your plane?
The Horrible Orville. So I think the crew named it after me.
Are you still horrible?
I hope not.
Were there many B-17 pilots that had come out of fighters or other kinds of aircraft? When they were
No,
training?
most of the B-17 pilots went through training as bomber pilots. With the Army Air Corps, when you got out of flight school, they said you had your choice, but usually if you asked for fighters, you went to bombers. You asked for bombers, you went to fighters. The way that worked. But most of the pilots were trained for as bomber pilots. That was, fighters was a specialty as well as bombers were. So after you got your wings, that's when you really went into whatever group you were going to go with. And most of the pilots our age, as I said, by the time I was, 18 years old, I had made major, which is almost unheard of. And actually, when I was in the hospital, because I was kind of paralyzed from the legs down, I got the Silver Star there, as well as I got a promotion as a lieutenant colonel at age 19, which is almost unheard of. So, but I'll tell you, it's funny. Rank over there is all you had to do was live long enough and do a decent job, and your rank went up because everybody else was getting killed.
How young were you when you joined the RCAF?
Actually, I just turned 17, or actually I was 16, but a couple months later I was 17. In fact, I had a co-pilot who we called Pops. He was the oldest guy in my crew, and Andy was, I believe, 23 or 24 at the time. And believe me, at 18, 19, I wasn't the youngest. There was one guy in our group was 16 years old until they found out about him, and they sent him home.
Tell us a little bit about flying the Spitfire.
The Spitfire was a great aircraft while you had it in the air. On the ground, as the Brits used to say, it has some nasty habits. It had a narrow undercarriage, and the landing and takeoffs were a little tricky. Where the Hurricane was a great aircraft as well. The Spit was a lot faster. I say it's about 50 miles an hour faster than the Hurricane. But as a gun platform, you couldn't beat the Hurricane. As an air-to-air combat, fighter-to-fighter, I'd want to fly a Spit. That was a great aircraft. But for going after the bombers, the Hurricane was a better aircraft for it. It's a little more maneuverable. Of course, the Spit was highly maneuverable as well. But for higher altitudes, when we came with the Mark 9, it was a two-stage blower. They put a supercharger. And one cut in, I remember, at 14,000. And then the second stage cut in at, I believe it was 24,000 feet. And boy, I tell you, that gave the Germans a new way of thinking. Because when they were first flying the Mark 1s up to Mark 5s, the Focke-Wulf 190 was a great airplane. It was probably the best thing they had, best thing anybody had at that time. And they had a picnic with us when we were flying our Hercs or our Spits, and they were shooting us down left and right. But when a guy by the name of Smith, Joe Smith, he was the assistant to a man by the name of Mitchell, who developed the Spitfire. But when he made the Mark 9, where they put with a Merlin power plant in it, and we were running close to 1,800 horse, but that had the two-stage supercharger. Now, when the Germans saw that aircraft, they thought it was going to be a picnic for them again, and boy, were they mistaken, because that Mark 9 would do anything the 190 did, and then some better. And now we just cleaned their clock for them.
Was it quite an adjustment having to retrain yourself to go over to a big, heavy 4-engine bomber?
Not really. Flying a plane is flying a plane. And I was, before I even went into service, I was licensed for multi-engine, which is twin engines. That's what the CAA. CAA was like what the FAA is today. But I'm going back here now before the war. This was back in 1934, 35, 36, and through there. But my first experience with a 4-engine aircraft was right down in Pueblo. The RCO at that time was Colonel Nazaro. He was a West Point man, incidentally, and by the time Joe retired, he was a 4-star general. And we had 3 different group commanders. Nazaro was the first one, and he's the one that really built the 381st up. And then had a guy by the name of Lieber, Colonel Lieber. He took over when Colonel Nazaro, he did make brigadier general when he went to headquarters. That's when Lieber took over. And then in 45, on our last mission, April 24th, I believe it was, that's a date you'll never forget. That's a guy by the name of Hall, Colonel Hall. He took over the 381st. And he was with it when the 381st was decommissioned. That time I was here back in the States. So,
You spent an awful lot of missions. You must have bombed just about everywhere.
God, I don't think there was a place that we didn't hit. When you talk about missions, probably the very worst mission of all was Schweinfurt, which Wayne has heard about Schweinfurt 100 times from me. But that was a date, this one date you'll never forget. And we referred to it as Black Thursday. That was August, I believe, 14th of 1943. There was a 2-prong attack. At that time, he was a colonel, was Curtis LeMay, who I'm sure you're well aware of. LeMay ran one task force, and he went to Regensburg. We were the second task force, and we went to Schweinfurt. But because of the weather, we took off very late, almost like about 4 hours, where we should have been taken off at 8 o'clock in the morning. We didn't leave until almost noon, where LeMay's group, they left when they were supposed to. But there was a real ball up with the fighters. They never did pick us up to escort us over. And at that time, our fighters could not go beyond a place called, it was in Brussels, Aachen, Germany, which was right on the border between Germany and Brussels. And they, in turn, that's where our fighters had to turn around and go back because of fuel. And that's when the Krauss hit us. And we lost 60 bombers. There's 10 men to a crew. That's 600 men. So the 8th Air Force took one hell of a shellacking at that time.
We have a guy in our hometown that we've interviewed who was one of the 600 men that went down. He was top turret gunner and was wounded in the back of the head at the time. The blood had froze over in the cold.
Yeah.
But he spent 6 months with the French underground, made it out, walked out over the Pyrenees.
And they did make it out.
Yes, but he was one of those that they made it to target. They were limping back.
Mm-hmm.
We're going down slowly and finally had to bail.
Yeah. Yeah, that brings back memories. Not a lot of times. A few times we came back on one motor. That's out of four, and luckily was able to make it. I'd say when you saw those white cliffs of Dover, boy, that was like looking at your mother's portrait. That was something else. That's when the oxygen mask came off, and we were, they'd all light up their cigarettes, and they were home.
Any tricky landings coming back like that with damage?
Yeah, there's a few. The some of the things they did, some of the ploys that were used, like if your landing gear was shot out, or if one of them was got, you're better off to wind up the other one and come in on a belly landing. You try not to hit the runway. You'd rather better off to make it on the grass in between. And some of them you didn't have any problem at all. Others, kind of a plain cartwheel or whatever, and if you were smart enough, you burned up all your fuel before it happened and dumped it some way. Sometimes they didn't do it; they just had it come in because of wounded aboard. When you had wounded aboard, you usually fired off 2 red flares, and that notified the ground control that you had wounded, and usually the ambulances wouldn't run right alongside you as you were landing. And one thing I will say, our medics over there were great. We didn't have any problems at all. In I don't know, our aircraft, I went through 3, 4, yeah, the 4th aircraft is one I got hit in. The rest of them were shot up pretty bad, what they call Category E. Category E when it was salvage. And it was just good getting back home here. And like I say, I was in Walter Reed for almost a year, not quite. And from the legs down, I just couldn't walk. I was in a wheelchair. But the doctors over there told me you'd never walk again. And, with my eyes, with my mind, I said, BS, I'm going to walk, which I did. I just made myself do it. And with the help of a cane, I get along pretty good now.
What about all of that time that you were over there? What was the mental state as you went along after you got so many missions? Did you really begin to think about mortality?
Endlessly. You didn't need a lot of missions to think that way either. I'll tell you, it was funny, and I think everybody I ever talked to about it, you had 2 frames of mind. Either you were absolutely bored, or you were deathly in fear, horrendously in fear. But you never had it in combat. That always set in after a while, usually after you got back, and while you were waiting around for your second mission or whatever. While you were actually in the air, you really didn't have time to think of fear. Those that did, the English had a terminology for it. They call it LMF, lacking moral fiber. That was stamped on there, what we had called a 201 file, your personnel file. And if you had that stamped on your file, you had no career in the RAF or any of the military services. We didn't quite revert to that. They call it a Section 8. Yeah, say with the Section 8s, they claim there's about 3% of the Ace Air Force personnel went Section 8. We called it going over the bend. Going over the bend was a little bit of a Looney Tune, and it happened to a couple of guys. I didn't have anybody in my crew that went that way, but there were people in my squadron that did. Another terminology they used was you bought the farm. That was, you actually got killed. And where that terminology came from, buying the farm, we had a $25,000 insurance policy on us. Obviously, enlisted men as well as the officers. And when it went to whoever you made your beneficiary, they got the $25,000, so that paid the farm off. That's where that expression came from. The other thing, one of somebody remarked here about when he came back from Schweinfurt. I have to remember now, I was just like an 18-year-old kid, really. And at that time, believe me, we grew up awful fast. But in our barracks, we had what they call Nissan huts. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was a dome shape type. And they were usually the pilots, co-pilots were in one, bombardiers, navigators were another, and so forth. Well, in my hut, I believe there were 16 men, and we were all pilots. When we came back from Schweinfurt, only 3 of us came back. 3 planes did, and my plane came back, and 2 others. That was out of I think we sent up 18 to begin with. But in my barracks, I was the only one in it. Everybody else was dead or POW, and I just couldn't sleep in those barracks there. So I took a comforter and went out and slept I went out in the middle of the flight line out on the grass and fell asleep out there. The guys in the tower saw me out there. They thought I went around the bend, So they called the old man up, and he sent a jeep out there to get it. And remember, at that time, I was a captain, and at 18 years old. And the only reason I made captain was that when I was in the RAF, I was a flight lieutenant, which is equivalent to a captaincy. So when I came into the Army Air Corps, they gave me my equivalent rank. But when I got back there, Colonel Nazaro realized what the problem was. And they called me in the office, and he was telling me about it. And he told the adjutant, I'm trying to remember the adjutant's name, I think his name was Shackley, because he finally made air exec. But he says, put the captain in one of the bungalows. These were for field grade officers only. That was your own private little home. I believe it was Shackley who made the statement. He said, well, sir, that's only for field grade officers. And I'll tell you, here's the kind of a guy Nazar was. He reached in his desk, pulled out a set of gold oak leaves. He says, you're a major now, which is the first grade of a field grade officer. And that's how I made major at 18.
Gosh. You had talked about Schweinfurt being one of the worst raids. What were some of the others that, anything particularly memorable happened?
Dresden was no picnic. Berlin was probably, the beginning in Berlin was the worst. Well, one of the worst, I should say, because they had more anti-aircraft guns there, the 88s and the 135s. I'd say they had 2,000 or 3,000. And what the Germans did, they used what they called a box barrage. Box barrage, they didn't aim at an aircraft. They knew what our bombing run was. And when we were coming in on the initial point, we call it the IP, that's where Ike turned controls over to the bombardier, because he's the one that actually flew the plane at that time. That's when we were on the bomb run. What he did, wherever he put the crosshairs on the Norden bomb site, that's where the plane would fly. The only thing I had to do was to maintain altitude and speed. But they'd set their barrage block up where they were all firing at one spot in the air continuously. And that was 1,000 feet long and 1,000 feet wide. And they could set the detonation of the projectiles, the explosive rounds, to blow up in there. Now, they knew what altitude we were coming in at. We knew exactly where we were flying. When you looked at that from the air looking at it on a horizontal view, it just looked like one huge black cloud. You could get out there and walk on it. It looked that thick. You didn't have to worry about it unless you saw red dots. When you saw red dots, you knew you were pretty well going to get hit. But there was only one defense against it. And this is an old story. It starts out, our Father who art in heaven. That's the only defense you had. And you couldn't do any evasive maneuvers because you had to fly that pattern. And we flew as a group coming in. And we had what we called a Pathfinder. This was General LeMay's notation, how to bomb. Up to that point, everybody was bombing individually however they wanted to. But when LeMay started, we were doing precision box bombing. That was where the lead plane, which we called a Pathfinder, those were usually the very best pilots, the best navigators, and the best bombardiers of the group. And when we flew that, as soon as my bombardier got in there and the doors opened up, everybody in the back of our group could see it, and everyone else opened their doors of bomb bays up. And as soon as he released his bombs, everybody released their bombs. And remember, those groups could be a mile, 2, 3, 4, 5 miles long. If we had maybe, say, 2 or 3 divisions like we had for Schweinfurt, that was over 30 miles long. So they bound by group, not by the whole division or by the whole the squadrons, individual squadrons. But we flew what they call the lead squadron. That's where the Pathfinder was. The low squadron and the high squadron. Those were made up. Each squadron was called an element, and there was 3 bombers in each one. There was here, the lead, and the high, and then the whole group was that way, and then that whole group became one element, and they were all made up into a division. And in a division, there was actually about 30 aircraft in a group, and for a division that was made up of 3 groups. And there you're looking around 247 aircraft. And when you get those spread out over a long area, you could be 20, 30 miles long. So the bombardiers had to know how to pace the release of their bombs. Because if the guy in front dropped his and the guy 30 miles back dropped his, he wouldn't even be hitting the city.
Were you harassed by fighters constantly on the way on those longer missions, or were they just at spots?
Oh no, I'll tell you, on Schweinfurt, that was the other thing. We still swear to God that there was some pillow talk going on before we even left, because the Krauts had every aircraft they owned waiting for us. They even had Stukas, the Ju-87s, which was a dive bomber. It wasn't a fighter aircraft at all, but they had even them in the fray. And they were flying above us, dropping bombs down on us. And the fighter aircrafts, the best aircraft they had was that 190 until they came out with the 262, which was the Messerschmitt 262. In fact, that's the plane that got me. They had 4 30-millimeter cannon. They didn't have machine guns in it. And remember, 30 millimeters is a little over about 1.25 inches, a little about an inch, 1.2 inches, I think it was, diameter of the 30 millimeter projectile. But he raked the whole side of my ship, killed the port waist gunner, missed my engineer, fortunately, but killed my co-pilot. I don't even want to get into that. Co-pilot was a very, very good friend of mine, and actually took his head off, blew his head right off of his body. And I can't even begin to tell you what it's like. The heart keeps beating, and the blood just is like a fire hose coming out of the top of the guy. That whole flight deck, from the top to the bottom, was just drenched in blood. The engineer finally got out of. The engineer was the top turret. He came down, and he could fly a plane too. And we pulled Andy out of the seat, and he took over because I couldn't move my legs at all, so I had no rudder control. But I could change the azimuth of the plane by increasing or decreasing the RPM of my engines. But for landing, what I was worrying about was the brakes, and the engineer, he was able to handle that pretty well. But we put the plane down, and I remember just taking the plane up to our reverment and parked the brake, and I remember hitting the master switch, and that's the last thing I remember. Next thing I knew, I woke up at a C-46 on my way back to the States in a hospital plane, and that's when they put me into Walter Reed.
After you recovered and got out of Walter Reed, did you ever fly again?
I'll tell you, you couldn't get me near an aircraft for almost 2 or 3 years. I'd take a train before I take an aircraft, but then I got out of it, and I went to work for a company, Dayton Aviation Radio and Equipment. When I got out, I went to college, at the university, as an electrical engineer, and we were manufacturing airborne communications and navigation equipment, Omni, VOR, just for instrument flight systems, instrument landing systems. And what was it? That was just before the Korean War. And, you could buy aircraft, like today an AT-6, which you'll call the old, in England we call them, in Canada it was a training aircraft, we call it the Harvard. And the United States was known as a Texan. And they could buy them brand new for $800. Today you couldn't touch them for less than probably close to, I'd say 800,000, 900,000. But I bought two of them for $1,600. That's when I was with Dare. And then when the Korean War came up, the Army, the Air Force, that it was Air Force at that time, it was no longer Army Air Corps, they bought them back from us. In fact, we didn't have anything to say about it. They just confiscated them. But they did pay us $25,000 apiece for them. So that was a good investment.
The yellow plane that's out in the tarmac, is that an AT-6?
Right. That's a Harvard. The two of them. Those are Navy.
What's your feeling about seeing, when was the next time you saw B-17 after the war?
After the war? I think it was, Wayne took me to, what airport was it? Where we saw that, not the Shady Lake, a Sentimental Journey. That was the name of the aircraft. It was here, that was about 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And they had it, that belonged to the Confederate Air Force. They were flying it. I understand they changed their name, it's no longer, I think it's called Memorial Air Force now.
Commemorative Air Force.
Commemorative, that's it.
It's still CAF, but
Yeah,
they changed.
right.
What was the feeling when you saw the plane?
I tell you, it's funny. I was looking at it and I mentioned to Wayne, because we were talking about flying in it, take a flight in it. And we found out it was almost $400, 300 something. And I mentioned to Wayne, I says, I remember a day I would have paid 10 times that amount not to fly in it. The guy next to me overheard me. And he asked me a few questions. And he's a school teacher and he's writing a book on the B-17. So he got my name and address, and he did call me, and he's interviewing me for his book. I don't know what stage the book's at this point in time, but he teaches school here in Colorado, in Denver someplace. He told me the name, which I forgot. Remember, I'm 82 years old, and memory ain't what it used to be.
What do you think about this airplane?
I was trying to remember that I saw the identification on it. There was no squadron marking on it, but they do that. It was the 1st Division, the triangle. That is the 1st Division, and the W. I think the W was Hampshire. I think that's where that aircraft was from originally, if that was it, unless they just marked it. I don't know.
We just talked to the man who flew it for 23 years for EAA, and he flew, they painted it, this one was at the end of the war, it never made it overseas.
Oh, okay.
But they painted this one to reflect his group that he flew of out of England.
Do you remember what he said his group number was?
It's the 1st Air Division.
1st Air Division, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was a triangle. But I wonder what his group was.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
I can't either. But
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, but that's why it's painted in those markings. That was his group, and
Yeah, but I noticed he didn't have a squadron marking on it at all. Usually it was 2 letters, like my group. Well, we had the 532, 533, 534, 535. We were VP, SP, LP, and forget the 5th one. I think that was VP, the 5th, the squadron, I should say. Because each group was made up of 4 squadrons. And there was like 12 planes to a squadron.
all in all, would you prefer flying a bomber or a fighter?
I would prefer the fighter. Because first of all, I could do evasive maneuvering. And the main thing
Well, hold up for a second.
is that with a fighter, I'm captain of my own destiny. I know what I'm doing, and not to sound overly, how can I put this euphonically? I was a damn good pilot, period. I knew what I was doing, and I'm sure even as a fighter pilot, I would have survived, providing there wasn't some fluke that happened, which happened to a lot of guys. Because when you take some of the German pilots, our top man, our top fighter pilot, was a guy by the name of Colonel Grabowski. He was from Oil City, and I knew Gabby well. And Gabby had 28 planes to his credit. In the Luftwaffe, he was considered a novice. The average German pilot who survived was anywhere from 100 to 200 to 300 kills to his credit. Guy by the name of Erich Hartmann, 352 kills. 352. He was the leading top ace. The general of the Luftwaffe was a guy by the name of Adolf Galland. He had over 100. Most of all those little pilots, they were well over 100 kills. You know, our top man in the Pacific was Major Wong, and he had 40. He was flying P-38s. But the English was the same way. Their top man was a guy by the name of Johnny Johnson. Johnson had, I think, 29 or 30 to his credit. And he was top fighter pilot. When I say top, I'm talking about how many kills they had. And cause I only had 3 because I wasn't flying that long when they pulled me out and put me in the 8th as a bomber pilot. But no, between the two, I'd definitely rather fly a fighter because you didn't have to worry too much about anti-aircraft. The only thing I had to worry about was the Hun and the sun. That's where you had to watch it. The old expression was, beware of the Hun and the sun, because invariably that's where they came after you at. And it was the same thing as a bomber pilot, though. But here's something you want to remember about the B-17. We had 13 machine guns on board. At 13 machine guns, this was going to sound somewhat odd, but we could put out, I think it was 127 ton of projectiles. That's 50 caliber machine gun bullets. That's like 138 ton from that's per minute, incidentally. Because the Browning 50 caliber M2 machine gun fired 13.8 rounds per second. That's 800 rounds per minute. When you multiply that out by 13, you're looking at a tremendous amount of firepower. See, for a long time, our top brass said that the B-17 was complete. It was a flying fortress. That's where it's got its name. Nothing could touch it. Nobody would come near us. Well, boy, that was a misnomer, because they did come near us. And even as a group, LeMay is the one who set up the flying, the combat box, how we were positioned, which gave the maximum amount of firepower. But even with that, when the 262 came out, they only had like maybe 3 to 4 seconds of firepower, and they invariably came at us head on, right directly head on. And when we were flying the Fs, we only had 2 cheek machine guns. That's in the cheeks of the B-17. And when they came out with the G model, we had the 2 machine guns in the pod underneath the nose, which this plane out here has. And that really gave us a lot more protection. But you have to think, our bombing runs were about 150, 180 miles an hour. The 262, when he was coming at us at well over 500 miles, 480 to 500, 550 miles per hour, which gives a closing speed of well over 600, 700 miles an hour. At that speed, you're covering, in a minute, feet, really. And they only had maybe 3 or 4 seconds of actual firepower. But our gunners, they had to be on the ball in order to hit them. And we did hit some of them. And our fighters could not handle the 262 because they were too darn fast. The only way our fighters could shoot at them was to get them on landing or takeoff. Because the 262, it took them almost 5 minutes to come up to flying speed. And they couldn't give it full throttle on takeoff because they'd blow up the power plant, the jet engine. So our 51s and 47s would be waiting up above them, circling around waiting for them to take off, and then dive in on them and shoot them at the time of takeoff or landing. Of course, at that time too, the Krauts finally woke up to it, and they were sitting up there with their fighters. Not the 262s, but with their 108s, 109s, and 110s, trying to shoot our fighters down. But still, between the 2 aircraft, to answer your question, I'd much sooner fly a fighter than I would a bomber. because I had more leeway with the fighter.
1 minute on the tape. You have a last question, or we've covered a lot of ground here.
No, I think we've covered a lot, so, do you feel like you've been interviewed?
Yeah, however you want to handle it,
So.
I'm okay.
The only thing, have you had any reunions with,
Yes, we no longer have them, the 381st, because at the last reunion, I think there was only 12 of us left. And that's out of, I think we had 3,200 men for the group. And we all went up to, we had, I think it was 4 or 5 reunions previous to that. And a couple times we all went to Mattingly. Mattingly is in, if I remember right, Oxfordshire. That is where the big cemetery is. That's where all of our dead were buried. And we had memorial services there. And I remember our chaplain was a Major Brown, and he did the services there. And I'll say one thing about the people of Ridgeway. They set a memorial up at our gates going into our field, into the Ridgeway, the 381st Bomb Group. And to this day, every day, somebody comes up there and puts fresh flowers. And I think, remember, that's something that happened 60, 65 years ago. And there's people still remember it. And even the younger people, stories passed on where they still have people coming up putting the flowers at the gate. Which kind of brings a tear to your eye when you think of it.